Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
What happens when millions of Americans lose these unemployment benefits? What are the policies that are widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots in this country? Without dramatic policy changes, 500 million people will be pushed into poverty globally as a result of the pandemic. Millions of them live right here in the United States. I am super excited about my next guest. He is the nation's foremost authority on poverty. He's a minister, a civil rights leader, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and author of We Are Called to Be a Movement. Joining me this morning is Reverend Dr. William Barber. Good morning, Dr. Barber. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I've often seen you on CNN and I hear about your exploits and your power, but thank you for having me this morning in these serious times.
Well, I can't tell you how excited when my producer told me that you were actually available and free and we're coming onto the show. I'm an advocate, so I'm always just super excited when I get to meet who I consider to be the ultimate advocates, in this time. And you are definitely the ultimate advocate for people all over this country and all over the globe. And the reason I wanted to talk to you this morning is because something really drastic is about to happen in this nation. We are in the midst of this pandemic, rising cases all over the country. And in the midst of this, the government is talking about ending this $600 supplemental benefit that has been the lifeline for millions of Americans. And the economists are clear. This is going to plunge millions of people into poverty. And you being an expert on poverty, what are we to make of these policies that keep widening this gap between the haves and the have-nots?
2 weeks ago on June 20th, well, a little bit over 2 weeks, 30 days ago, so we had the Mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington, a digital gathering, and over 2.7 million people turned in and 400,000 people took action because we focused on what poverty already looks like from the Appalachian Mountains to Alabama, from Maine to Mississippi. And I think we have to always start there. Before COVID ever hit, we had 140 million people living in poverty, Sister Martin, 43% of this nation, 700 people dying a day from poverty, and 250,000 people a year. And then we had 3 bills passed, and McConnell made it sure that 84% of all the money went to corporations and corporate heads and banks, not to the essential workers. In fact, a lot of the essential workers tell me they feel like expendable. They say, you call us heroes, but you treat us like zeros. This is what we're hearing in the street. And so in the midst of that, those bills, unemployment was not guaranteed, sick leave was not guaranteed, health care was not guaranteed, rent forgiveness was not guaranteed, making sure that utilities couldn't be cut off were not guaranteed. And yet corporations were guaranteed nearly $3 or $4 trillion. Right. So we have to first start with the bad policies that already exist and why poor and low income people have to get engaged. I like what your former guest was talking about, preparing, and then we need to add to that political engagement and using the internet and telephones and otherwise to be jamming these lines. Because what we're facing right now, if we don't pass another bill, and I think McConnell this morning said he's going to limit it to $1 trillion. Right. That's not enough. The House has passed $3 trillion, and that's not enough because it still doesn't guarantee health care, nor does it guarantee living wages for essential workers. So here's what we may end up with. Columbia University said we've already lost 50,000 people that didn't have to die, that could have been prevented. At least 50, it could be higher. We're talking about if this happens, we will have more Black, brown, Native, and poor white people who will die needlessly. On July 27th, the unemployment insurance will end. Right. 50 million people have filed unemployment insurance since March. Right. That's 58% of Black households lost their work, and 56% of people earning less than $50,000 lost their work. And we're hearing now that 40% of the jobs that made $40,000 and less will lose those jobs. That's the crisis that we're in, which is why poor and low wealth people must be engaged, must prepare to vote, because the only way we can turn this around is to turn it around through public policy. and people that are willing to do that.
I know, Reverend Barber, you've been on the front lines fighting for a living wage. And I read an article where one economist said we wouldn't have the big issue we have over this $600 supplemental benefit if people made a living wage. If people made a minimum of $15 an hour, we wouldn't have this issue that we have with respect to unemployment benefits. Have we made any progress? I know I live in Los Angeles, so I know Los Angeles and other cities, Seattle, near California, have already enacted ordinances that have raised the minimum wage to a minimum of $15. But on a national level, where are we in terms of getting to a national living wage?
Well, where we are is right. There's certain places have in fact done that. Now, some of them have put it on a gradual scale, which we don't agree with, because by the time you get to 7 years from now, 15 will be too low. But we have seen some progress. And just this past Monday, we had a strike for Black lives in which white and black and brown and young and old and gay and straight took strikes from their jobs to say we need to protect voting rights, we need $15 in a union, and we need health care. Now, where we are is, as I said, not one of the bills we passed in the midst of COVID. I want to think about this. In the midst of COVID, how hard-hearted McConnell is being. They refuse to even give low-income essential workers a bonus, let alone a living wage. And we're talking about the people who are upholding this economy. You see, before COVID, 62 million people made less than a living wage. That meant that there's not a county in this country where you can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment, even if you work 40 hours plus at a minimum wage job. Federally, the bill has already been passed in the House, Sister Martin. And I'm from the country, so I do sister. I'm sorry, but that's just a preacher thing. But the bill has been passed in the House. It's being held up by McConnell in the Senate. Now, when it comes to giving corporations money, they get $2 trillion in 48 hours. When it comes to our people getting health care and living wages, nothing. Now, if people had made a living wage, they would have resources. You see, when we talk about poverty and low wealth today, we're talking about some people are poor and low wealth who work every day, who work 50 hours a week, but they're less than $400 away from an economic disaster. And a study just came out yesterday that said if you do not have health care and you go to the hospital to get treated for COVID symptoms, even if you live, your bill could be $75,000. $75,000. So, but here's the other side: a living wage of $15 an hour. Now think about this: 25 million people are receiving unemployment. That's $15 billion. If we don't pass a new bill to cover that, $15 billion will drop from the economy immediately. And some are saying 10 million people are homeless, can't afford, even before COVID. And we're talking about 26 million people that could face evictions if we don't pass another bill. Now, here's the flip side. If we had paid $15 an hour, or if we started tomorrow, they could pass it tomorrow. 49 million people would move from poverty and low wealth immediately. And $368 billion would be added to the economy immediately. Think about that now. If we don't pass this bill, $15 billion could drop out, boom, immediately. But if we were to pass living wages, $360 plus billion could be pushed into the economy immediately. And if it was a housing wage, it was something like 73 million people would be raised out of poverty and low wealth, and the number would be in the 700 and some odd billion dollars. So we're hurting ourselves. That's the point. The cost of inequality it costs less to fix inequality and poverty than it does to allow it to continue.
And then that's the big question, Reverend Barber. If these, if it's in our economic best interest to increase the living wage and to enact these policies that you've just identified, why do we see this resistance? Why are we fighting, trying to get, working class people $600 when wealthy people have gotten trillions of dollars from the Stimulus Act, from the Trump tax cut, and so many other policies that favor the wealthy in our society? Why are we begging for crumbs at this point?
Well, I think three things are happening in this kind of country. Number one, both political parties have been locked into a neoliberalism understanding of economics. And for the Republicans, that means you give to the top and trickle down. For the Democrat, it means you talk about the middle class. You never talk about poverty and low wealth for the most part. The fact of the matter is, if we don't address from the bottom up, we're not going to fix this. Too often Republicans racialize poverty, Democrats run from poverty. What we need to do is focus on poverty. That's one thing. Second thing is, we have voter suppression. And people say, well, what does that have to do with poverty and low wealth? Every state that is a voter suppression state, we've had 26 of those since 2010, where people get elected because of racialized voter suppression. There's something like 26 members of the United States House that owe their on the Republican side, that owe their elections pretty much to racist voter suppression. Once we can measure and we can show statistically how people who get elected through racist voter suppression also vote against living wages, also vote against health care. So they get elected through a process that targets Black people and brown people. But once they get elected, they go after all people, regardless of their race and color, because their goal is to give more money to the corporate, because their mindset is trickle down. The third thing is we have to have a new people in office. But here's the good news. We have a study coming out. I can't break it all today, but basically this study is going to show how if just 10 to 12, 15% of poor and low income people were registered to vote who didn't vote, they fundamentally changed the political calculus in every state in this country, even in the South, where 1/3 of all poor people live. We can actually bring Black and white people together through this economic issue that also shows how racism is connected to the economic disparity for all people. And Dr. King told us in '65, at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said, every time there's a possibility for Black and brown, white, poor people to come together, the aristocracy sows division. So here we are almost 100 days from an election. Poor and low wealth people, that's what we're doing. We're organizing in the hills of Kentucky and in the Delta of Mississippi, have the power to change the United States Senate and to change the presidency and to fundamentally shift the votes, the voting in this country. So I'm saying the parties that want to win, you need to make sure you're investing in poor and low wealth people, because all of these changes, charity is good, churches giving out food is good, we do that, but you can't fix 58% of Black households, losing their work with just charity. You cannot fix 140 million people in poverty, 43% of the nation. And the stats tell us it's going to be over 50% in the midst of COVID eventually. Those things can't be fixed privately. You have to have public policy adjustment.
I just have two questions for you. I know you've got to run, Reverend Barber, but I want to ask you, so often in this country, when people think of poor people, they think of minorities. And with Trump in office, he has demonized minorities and has, sown the seeds of division between, people of color and white people in this country. And a lot of people have this vision that when they are helping poor people or they're voting for policies that impact poor people, that they're somehow helping Black and brown people, not recognizing that, poverty has no color. How do we, change that narrative and get people to understand the reality of poverty, that poverty impacts, as you talked about, poor white people are as negatively impacted by these policies as African Americans, Latinos, and other people of color?
Well, Trump is using the Southern strategy from the 1960s that was designed intentionally to keep Black and white people and brown people from talking to each other, so that the Republican Party could control the South, the 13 former Confederate states, and thereby control 170 electoral votes. So this is an old game that he's playing. He's just more vicious and more vocal of how he's doing it. The reality is, though, we have to teach. And so we've been traveling across this country. That's the Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival. We have 45 coordinating committees. And when we go in, we show people the intersections. And when we say this in the room, what I'm getting ready to say to you now, people curse in ways I can't talk because they didn't know. I mean, they say, what the? And I said, well, hold up now, but let's do something about it. There are 140 million poor and low wealth people. Now let's break that down. 61% of all African Americans are poor and low wealth. 61%. So African Americans are disproportionately affected by poverty. 68% of Latinos. But 61% of African Americans in raw numbers is 26 million people. 31 to 32% of white people are poor and low wealth. But in raw numbers, that's 66 million people. So there are 40 million more poor and low income white people in raw number than there are in black people. So it has a disproportionate effect on black people. But in raw numbers, there are more white people on SNAP, more white people on food stamp, more white people in poverty and low wealth than black. When we were in Kentucky, Areva, we were teaching this up in the mountains in Harlan County. And I put up a map and showed all of the people that got elected in Kentucky by racist voter suppression. And then I showed how those same people vote against healthcare and vote against unions that those coal miners need and vote against living wages. And one guy looked at that and he said, well, damn, excuse me, but that's what he said. He said, but damn, Reverend, we're being played against each other. And I said, that's what I'm trying to teach you. And then he said, well, we need to get together. And we said, well, let's do that. And so now they're organizing in Harlan County, predominantly white, and Louisville, you know, a great number of blacks. They turned 3 counties in Kentucky from red, so-called red to blue. White folk organizing with black folk around an agenda that deals with race and poverty. So you're exactly right. We have to make America understand this, that you cannot racialize poverty, right? You have to realize, in fact, we have to teach people this. My grandmother said, if you scratch a lie, you find a thief. So if racism is a lie, if you scratch a racist, you find a thief. If a person is a racist, they'll also steal your health care. They'll steal your living wages. They'll steal your clean air and your clean water because they'll allow the corporate polluters. So ultimately, racism is targeted systemically at black and brown people, but racism is really a hatred for democracy itself. Racism is. I
gotta let you go, Reverend Barber, because I promised your team I would. But before you get out of here, tell us how people can join the Poor People's Movement and how we can take action to be a part of this movement that is really going to change, you know, this entire country.
Well, I've just heard something good news today. I've got to verify, but I just heard the Democrats put a major platform for the first time in their platform called Ending Poverty. And we've been pushing to change the narrative. Go to www.breachrepairs.org or either www.june2020.org. This coming Sunday, we are rebroadcasting the Mass Poor People Assembly, Moral March on Washington, a digital affair. You can tune in at 4 o'clock. You can sign up then. You can also take action with us. And this focus now we're turning to voting and registering people to vote. And so join us this coming Sunday at 4 o'clock on the East Coast. If you can't do that, just go to www.june2020.org or www.breachrepairs.org. Sign up, join up, let's fight together. And if we lift from the bottom, everybody rises. You can't lift from the middle, can't lift from the top. We have to lift from the bottom.
Okay, before I let you go, you have to promise me to come back, spend an hour with me. I'm a civil rights lawyer and an advocate, and there's so much more I want to ask you and so much more I want to talk to you about.
So what am I going to do? Stay on the way of no? You are a lawyer indeed.
Okay, got you. I got you. And I got thousands and thousands of witnesses.
Yeah, I don't want to be on the stand when you interrogate me. I don't want to be on the stand when you interrogate me. But listen, we would like to talk about the 5 interlocking injustices, because here's the last thing I would say. You cannot separate them. As I tell people, if you look at me, and if you happen to like me, you have to also deal with the fact that I am the result of a whole lot of fusion. Now, some of it wasn't maybe welcome, but the reality is I'm part Tuscarora, I'm part white, I'm part black. I come from the country, I've lived in the city. All of that helps make up who I am. But what am I talking about? We say that there are 5 interlocking injustices that you have to deal with simultaneously. It's almost like when you're prosecuting a case as a lawyer, you have to look at all the pieces. Systemic racism in all of its forms toward black people, brown people, and native people. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, because all the money we need to do this is in the bloated military budget. That's a whole nother story. And then we have to deal with what's called the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that says if you want prayer in the school, if you're against gay people and against women and for guns and for tax cuts to the wealthy, then somehow you're on the righteous side of God, which is a form of heresy. I'd love to come back and talk to you about moral fusion, interlocking injustices, and why we have to have an intersectional movement like we're building.